And of course, welcome to everybody. It is terrific to have your company for this, the last Fellows findings for the 2025 season. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Franks, and I look after the Fellows here at the library, which includes being involved in sharing some of their research that they've been doing here, usually in the Mitchell Reading Room, but using a lot of our collections as well. Today, it is a great treat to present a researcher who picked something, let's call it ambitious. So this is one of those marvellous presentations where we're getting a little bit of a glimpse of what is to come, which is absolutely fantastic. I do like these sneak peek work in progress almost presentations. So some of the larger projects do take several years to realise, and today's work is no exception. So Dr. Chi Chi Huang is an historian who specialises in the social and health histories of the Asia Pacific. So, you know, large. And she's been working as a Keesing Fellow here in the Horn Room and in the Mitchell Reading Room on the idea of how traditional Chinese medicine has influenced and has interacted with more mainstream Western concepts of medicine here in Australia. So I'm going to hand over to her. If you have any questions, please pop them in the little speech bubble thing that you have at the top of your Teams screen. I'm still trying to adjust from Zoom to Teams. I can never remember whether it is chat or Q&A, but there's a cute little icon at the top and you click it and you can type in a question. So please do that throughout this morning's presentation, and I'll be back in a little while to do some Q&A with Chi Chi. But now, thanks Chi Chi, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And thank you to you all for joining and showing interest in this topic. Shortly after I took the fellowship in 2024 now, I actually moved to Hong Kong for work and a bit of a career pivot. And that is actually where I'm presenting from today. So I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which this history that I talk about today has played out on. And as a migrant of Chinese descent exploring the topic of medical pluralism in Australia, I want to acknowledge how non-white migrants in Australia have also benefited off the historical displacement of First Nations people. And I hope that the writing of culturally diverse histories can not only unearth the multitude of ways in which modern Australia came to be, but also create a dialogue of how the recognition of First Nations is actually everyone's responsibility and part of everyone's journey, regardless of cultural background. So a little bit, oh, hold on. Beep. There we go. A little bit about me and this history project. Thank you, Rachel, for providing me with that introduction and the caveat there. But this research into Chinese medicine in Australia really began, I guess, as a seed from my own experiences as a kid growing up in Australia. And there's a picture of little me there. And despite having a rather non-Anglo name, Chi Chi, I didn't grow up in what I thought was a traditionally Chinese household, whatever that meant, with the exception, though, of when I got really sick. Mum would hedge all her bets, as I'm guessing any good mother would do, and she would take me first to a Western medical doctor, mostly because they were right in our suburb or in the suburb next to us, depending on who was open, and then drag a feverish, drugged up child across Sydney to see our family friend, who happened to be a practicing traditional Chinese medicine doctor. Keesing, as we called him, was always really cheery with me and it kind of made the whole sort of diagnosis process actually quite fun for me. But it would be all the more confusing when, you know, the prescription was inevitably a rather bitter brew of something. And even the sweets afterwards would never quite get rid of that strong taste. And then as a teenager, I noticed how goji berries became really popular in mainstream Australian culture. They were labelled the new superfood, and you can now get them at Woolies and Coles for a rather pricey figure. And this was really bizarre to me because we had kilos of this stuff at home. And every time I spoke to my grandmother on the phone, she would always tell me about why I should be drinking goji berry tea every single day, how it increases circulation of the blood. And so it was odd for me to kind of witness these conversations around something that I thought was my nan's, you know, nagging in popular culture. And then as an adult, my friends from other cultural backgrounds would seek the services of acupuncturists, of Chinese medical doctors for various sports injuries, chronic ailments, and also for fertility assistance. And all of this is to say that I kind of saw this acceptance of Chinese medicine within my own upbringing in Australian culture over time. And this in some ways mirrored my own understanding of myself as an Australian coming from a Chinese background. But it did make me question, how do migrant cultures view and balance health? How do they practice different modes of health? And how was it that traditional Chinese medicine became part of Australia's public health landscape? Did this medical pluralism build off or fit in with Australia's drive to multiculturalism? And also, what about other folk traditional forms of medical knowledge? How did it all fit together? So, armed with all of these various thoughts, I applied for this fellowship at the State Library of New South Wales, where they house many Chinese language newspapers, different journals of Oriental and alternative medical associations and societies, as well as different outputs on traditional Chinese medicine. And suffice it to say, and as Rachel emphasized, it's a really large project in that there are lots of different tendrils that I can chase down rabbit holes, and but it's fun. It may be a bit more off than I can chew, especially with an international move. But what I want to present here today are some of the considerations and details surrounding the story of how Chinese medicine became a regulated practice today in Australia, which has been written by some scholars. Okay, still cannot. So, I think it is really important in order to understand the development of Chinese medicine in Australia by kind of contextualizing it with the history of traditional Chinese medicine in China. The history of traditional Chinese medicine in China is actually relatively recent. Chinese medicine is an old knowledge system and practice. However, traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM, as it has been labeled today, was really consolidated and promoted only after the founding of the modern state of the People's Republic of China by the CCP. Under the preceding Republican era and in the last few decades of imperial China, Chinese medicine was actually a battleground for many statesmen and officials, because having medical modernization meant having political modernization. For those leading the state and in charge of the bureaucratic and knowledge institutions during that period, they saw Chinese medicine as, quote, a threat to the health of the nation, as Bridie Andrews puts in her book, The Making of Modern Chinese Medicine, 1840 to 1960. Similarly, Sean Xiangling's lays Neither Donkey Nor Horse, Medicine in the Struggle Over China's Modernity. I realize I've just put them in the wrong order. Apologies about that. So his book provides a detailed account of the political jostling of Chinese medicine as superstitious versus embodied wisdom, as traditional versus modern, and how it is and isn't scientific under the dominant mode of clinical and laboratory sciences in the pre-CCP years. And as Kim Taylor argues, in her study of the evolution of Chinese medicine in early communist China, 1945 to 63, TCM as it is today is, quote, not so much a continuing tradition of the past as a deliberate distillation of ancient concepts according to the dictates of the 20th century. Taylor demonstrates that the push towards the scientization of Chinese medicine under the CCP in the 1950s reshaped how the practice could be interpreted as modern. No longer just Chinese medicine, it became traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM. It was labeled differently, firstly, and that by taking TCM into the labs, a foundation was set for the practice to be propelled onto the global stage and into international conversations in the following decades about what constituted health. And this is really a reminder that although how we understand our own health practices and choices are deeply personal, they do exist. They do not exist in a vacuum, and they have been affected by international politics and the interchange of culture. Sorry. There we go. Right. So turning to Chinese medicine in Australia. In Australia, the emergence of traditional Chinese medicine can be traced to the late 1960s and early 70s. That's not to say that Chinese medicine and practitioners were not in existence before then. Unsurprisingly, Chinese medicine was practiced from the mid 19th century in places where Chinese migrants had settled and worked. And these health practices catered actually to both Chinese and Anglo patients. James Flowers traces the history of these herbalists or doctors, two labels that were used by the practitioners interchangeably in colonial Australia. And he shows that they were not only competitive with Western trained doctors, but they bridged communities in Australia and also bridged communities across the seas with links to Hong Kong and other Chinese trading ports. Joanna Boileau, Michelle Bukov, and Nadia Rook have also written excellent pieces on Chinese doctors or individuals, and they really demonstrate how these migrants became embedded in colonial Australian communities whilst remaining quite vulnerable. They also flesh out the diverse networks that they cultivated and built around them through their practices. But in the 1970s, holistic health in Australia was gaining traction. And it was also, as it was also in several other Anglo-Western nations. Osteopathy and chiropractic professionals had formed several associations by then and had begun a drive towards a statutory registration from the 1960s through several commissioned parliamentary investigations. The Federal Committee of Inquiry into Chiropractic, Osteopathy, Homeopathy, and Naturopathy in 1977 resulted in a proposal of the statutory registration of chiropractors and osteopaths and the training of such professionals at tertiary institutions. So in Australia, the power to grant statutory registration for health professionals lies with the state and territorial governments. And so it became really upon the state level governments to act on this federal report and inquiry. Victoria and New South Wales were the first to respond to the results of this federal committee, and they created statutory registration of chiropractors and osteopaths in the following year in 1978, with all states and territories doing so by 1991. The reason why I'm telling you all of this is because it is an important part of the path of recognition for TCM in Australia, as Hans A. Bayer states that these two alternative health systems, quote, pave the way for the potential statutory recognition of other complementary medical systems. And taking a leaf from the same playbook, practitioners of Chinese medicine formed associations, developing self-regulatory mechanisms, called for and partook in parliamentary inquiries, wrote career curriculums, set educational standards for their practices from the 1970s onwards. So why did it take until the year 2000 for Chinese medical practitioners to achieve statutory registration in the state of Victoria, and until the year 2012 for a national registry? Well, according to O'Neill, Bayer, McDonald and James, and some other scholars, the division amongst various professional Chinese medical associations actually impeded consensus amongst the practitioners, and in fact, the governmental processes and multiple parliamentary inquiries that led to the recommending statutory registration facilitated the unity of the profession itself. So, for example, biomedical physicians who practice acupuncture seem to have privileged access to the National Health and Medical Research Council's working group on investigating acupuncture in 1987. And this resulted in the council's recommendation that acupuncture be restricted only to biomedical physicians. This sort of gatekeeping is not uncommon when it comes to the history of medical professionalizations, like that of midwives and obstetricians, of nurses, even amongst osteopaths and chiropractors, which is, yeah, a great history to read into as well. There is always an element of gatekeeping. In any case, the Acupuncture Ethics and Standards Organization, as well as some other TCM colleges, were discontent with the recommendation issued in 1987 that only biomedical physicians could practice acupuncture, and they called for a review. This then led to another working party that recommended tertiary education and training for any other health professionals interested in practicing acupuncture. And that the use of Chinese medicine, and as the use, of Chinese medicine and the number of practitioners grew in Australian society, with private funds expanding coverage to acupuncture and Chinese herbal medicine in the 1990s, as well as growing state concerns about the practice, the Victorian Department of Human Services actually called for research into the risks and benefits of TCM. This eventually led to the publication in 1996 of the influential report pictured there, Towards a Safer Choice, the practice of traditional Chinese medicine in Australia. This report formed the basis to recommendations on the regulation of TCM practitioners and on the passing of regulations of these professionals in Victoria in 2000 and eventually nationally in 2012. And indeed, the regulations passed in 2000 in Victoria was actually the first jurisdiction outside of China to do so. And this is earned praise, and also in some ways was a signal to others of the open environment that Australia had towards traditional Chinese medicine. So I know that was a lot. And this pathway towards it, that is because this pathway towards national recognition and the integration of Chinese medicine in Australia's public health as now an allied health profession is rather convoluted. And it did require the continual engagement from various voices within the industry, albeit all pushing slightly different agendas, but also an interest from a state perspective. The scholars I've mentioned and some others have covered this journey in a much more detailed way than I can possibly do here. And they have highlighted the successes and the continual barriers faced by these practitioners. However, what I think is missing is an understanding of the public discourse that was happening around traditional Chinese medicine during these milestones, ranging from the perception of the practice to who received it, as well as some economic considerations. And that's what the rest of my talk is about today. So the passing of the Chinese Medicine Registration Act in Victoria in 2000 did not exist in a vacuum of just the policy makers and practitioners, as these voices of support and speculation took to mainstream media to air their opinion. In The Age in April 2000, they reported that there was an alliance formed across several medical bodies, including the Australian Medical Association, AMA, the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners, and the College of Physical Medicine, calling for this bill to be overturned because it placed the Australian public at risk for two reasons. Sorry. First, because those on the Chinese Medicine Registration Board were not all medically qualified, though this was largely a misunderstanding on their part about the structure of the board. And second, they believed that a board would deceive the public into thinking those registered were qualified to provide other medical services. This argument is commonly leveled by established biomedical physicians against many other forms of alternative therapy, and it was repeated in the newspapers in 2012 when the National Register of Chinese Medical Practitioners was being implemented. For example, a long-serving physician in South Australia was interviewed and argued that the registration in 2012 gives these people legitimacy, and in the eyes of the public, they sound exactly like a GP. And while the concern surrounding harm and public interest is certainly valid and necessary, there is again an element of gatekeeping around who could use the title of doctor, and also an assumption around the choice to seek alternative health is a result of inadequate health literacy. Responding to the argument in 2000, Ray Takia, a practitioner of TCM and the president of the Chinese Medicine Association of Australia, appealed to those medical associations previously mentioned for reconciliation between the two medical traditions. And he also called out the media, quote, to desist from inflaming the volatile situation as the Victorian government introduces the Chinese Medicine Registration Bill into Parliament. Similarly, other supporters of Chinese medicine would also take a similar stance in the media during the 1990s and 2000s period, that these two medical systems were intentionally complementary and never designed to encroach on the domain of biophysical medicine. So another characteristic of how Chinese medicine was discussed in the public sphere was through reports of lay experiences. These stories throughout the 1990s and 2010s predominantly profiled Anglo-Australians seeking traditional Chinese medicine. So often these articles report on the rise and spread of traditional Chinese medicine in the country, and they would use a patient's experiences as illustration of this appeal. In The Age in November 1996, Suzanne Bennett, for example, described as a conventional mother of three, sought relief for a sinus issue from an unnamed Chinese doctor in Footscray. This doctor, quote, plunged needles between my eyebrows, but she felt an immediate flood of mucus drain out. It was scary, she said, but effective. In 2005, Daryl Jardine, a partner at a Brisbane law firm, was interviewed by the Courier about his turn to TCM and admitted that he never thought he would embrace it. Quote, I was a bit like some people are when I tell them I see a traditional Chinese practitioner. They think it's all hocus pocus. and that he hates the needles, but after seeking treatment and experiencing different modes of TCM, he, quote, feels focused and it gives me the concentration I need in court to work 60-hour weeks. These two patients, along with countless others interviews, including Rosanna Bozas, a Sydney mother, turned to TCM, quote, after Western treatments had let her down. For Rosanna, Western medicine diagnosed her with premature menopause in her 30s, and she looked to TCM to try for a second child, which she was able to do successfully, as she told the Weekend Australian in February 2003. And I think this impulse to seek alternative therapies outside your own framework of understanding is quite logical and speaks to a human experience of seeking control over one's own health. Furthermore, individuals do not approach health with necessarily the binary perspective that is being shaped by the practitioners, as previously mentioned. And as the first patient that I mentioned before, Suzanne Bennett, said, she did not, quote, regard herself as an advertisement for Chinese medicine. Rather, she believed that TCM and other alternative therapies should work alongside Western medicine. For consumers, it's not an either-or situation. And the reliance on the experiences of Anglo-Australians in the media to represent patient experiences of TCM is understandable, as it demystifies to those with a common cultural background what is referred to in the same breath as ancient, centuries-old, traditional, exotic, even bizarre craft. These patients' experiences lent credibility to alternative services, but were also used to explain the seemingly inexplicable rise of TCM in Australian society during the 1990s and 2000s. For example, in 2000, TCM was a $2.3 billion industry, which was nearly 4 times the public contribution to all other pharmaceuticals. And as the articles that I looked at suggest, this huge industry, the media often emphasize that this huge industry was not just catering towards to communities of Asian heritage in Australia. So at the same time that TCM was on a pathway towards integration in Australia's public health apparatuses, space for it within Australian society was being etched out and negotiated in the media in ways that were palatable. And something that I've noticed, but I've not been able to, I've been looking at the images as well, that sometimes accompany these articles. And what I also see is this sort of two tropes in which the doctors are being represented, depending on their background. What we see here on the left-hand side of the screen, the one under the title, is how there are frequent stories about how Anglo-Australians, white Australians, become traditional Chinese practitioners. And the images accompanying these tend to emphasize it in a more sort of organized, clinical, but still somewhat slightly different medical setting or sort of GP practice setting, as we see there with the quote from The Age, a patient waits as Robbie Todd prepares a mixture of herbs. While depictions and the ways in which Chinese medical practitioners of Asian backgrounds are being depicted tends to emphasize the ancient origins, the passing down of knowledge from generation to generation, as well as the peculiarities of the trade. So, for example, again in The Age, but in 1994, Dr. Ding Long there is pictured with the tools of his trade, including weird-shaped roots, bark, and a vast array of unpronounceable herbs and large deer tail. So again, so that's something that I'm seeing, and it's a direction that I kind of want to look at the visual grammar around how the practice and alternative medicines are being depicted. So, and also another idea that I would like to flesh out is the idea that TCM during the 1990s and 2000s was a bit of a poster child or functioned as a shorthand for other complementary and alternative medicine in Australia's public discourse. What I'm seeing in the media when alternative natural health is being discussed is that there was an ease with which Chinese medicine and acupuncture in particular would be called upon as an example or as one of the first examples. This is because this is perhaps, I think, it was and still is um, one of the bigger professions within alternative medicines in Australia, and thus it was a prominent example in a cohort of others. But similarly, on the flip side of this, the criticisms toward the natural and herbal health sector inevitably would also fall upon TCM itself. So, for example, in 2003, there was a review called for by the Parliamentary Secretary for Health, Trish Worth, after the recall of about 1,600 pharmaceutical products in April of that year. Um, this review also called for all the other states except Victoria to introduce legislation and to regulate practitioners of Chinese medicine and acupuncture as well. So how TCM can help hinder or obscure other complementary and alternative health modes, I think, is a worthwhile question. When the National Registration for Chinese Medical Practitioners was implemented in 2012, it was also the same year that there was mandatory registration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health practitioners. This relationship and dynamic has not really been investigated or discussed, and arguably, these two sets of practitioners do serve different communities and perhaps want to preserve serving different communities, but conversations around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and their knowledge systems have not experienced the same sort of attention in Australia's public discourse in recent years as Chinese traditional medicine. Okay, so there is also an element of economic opportunities for Australia that accompanied the development of Chinese medicine in the country. So in 2003, the Australian Research Centre for Complementary and Alternative Medicine was actually tasked with investigating the effectiveness of herbal medicines, including Chinese medicine, with the Victorian government providing about half of the estimated $1 million in funding. The investment by the state government, quote, was to explore the potential benefits to Australia of farming raw herbal products for the massive and growing worldwide market for alternative medicine. So here we have a direct statement about the economic potential. The Rural Industries Research and Development Corporation, the RIRDC, now known as AgriFutures Australia, also had an Asian foods R&D program between 1993 and 2010. Their research aimed to foster new Australian industries, providing innovative, high-quality foods and consumable products with Asian origins. And in 2012, they published a report on the health benefits of traditional Chinese medicines, weighing the scientific evidence, with the aim to explore new opportunities in Chinese medicinal plants. This information was for public knowledge, but particularly it was geared particularly towards capturing, quote, new investors and rural producers, and to provide avenues for farmers to manage change and diversify. So although the research did not provide any particularly strong recommendations, they advocated for continual assessment for the possibility and potential of Chinese medicinal plants in Australia, because the global market was expected to reach US 5 trillion in 2050. The RIRDC, it's a bit of a mouthful, that acronym, believed that the Australian industry could contribute to this, as Australian horticulture had already built a strong sector in Australian vegetable production from the mid-1990s. Furthermore, they found that out of the 500 plants, crops that they surveyed, 23 of them were already cultivated in Australia at the time, with a potential for about 30 new different crops to take root in Australia. And they also found that there are at least 17 Asian medicinal plants that were identified as Australian Indigenous species. And this last observation by the RIRDC speaks to how Chinese medicine has come to exist as a dominant knowledge system over other folk and traditional medical knowledge. So the recognition for the growing international and domestic market for Chinese medicinal products from Australia also provided an important avenue for the deer farming industry of the country. This industry in the 1990s was dying down, but interest in velvet antlers, so that's young antlers, from Australia in the 2000s actually reignited profits for Australian deer farmers. And in fact, in 2003, the RIRDC also produced a report titled Velvet Antler, a summary of literature on health benefits, as part of this wave. In reporting on the industry and the report, Andy Cohen from the Deer Industry Association of Australia wrote a two-part response where he was excited and extolled the possibilities of new antler stem research for TCM and general health, as well as excitement about the variation in prices for velvet antlers. So the supplement industry is obviously another sector in Australia that was interested in the expansion of Chinese medical products in the late 2000s. But so were Chinese investors who were keen to fund research institutes in Australia on Chinese medicine, such as the National Institute of Complementary Medicine in the late 2000s, as well as the Garvan Institute in 2008, which received funding in partnership to study the medicinal qualities of bisamelin for type 2 diabetes. And also, as recently in 2024, the University of Tasmania partnered with Nanjing University of Chinese Medicine, funded by private investors, to understand the suitability of the Australian geography, particularly of Tasmania, for potential TCM crops. Although the University of Tasmania has actually started these sorts of experiments with growing traditional medical herbs for TCM, after an MOU was signed between the Tasmanian government and the National Administration of Traditional Chinese Medicine in 2015. So although small, these research grants and investments are in part a way in which TCM has been integrated into Australia through the economic potentials. So thank you for listening to this. But I hope that by highlighting these conversations that were occurring in the 90s onwards surrounding the process in which Chinese medicine was integrated into Australia's public health system, I want to suggest that it was systematized and developed as a result of live conversations, not just in Australia, but across national borders. Indeed, Victoria was at the forefront of this global conversation at one point when it became the first jurisdiction outside of China to set up a government body to regulate and administer Chinese medical practitioners. But this conversation was not just taking place between bureaucratic bodies, but it was an ongoing and active public conversation about changing lifestyles. There are, however, still many questions around this project that I am still considering and continue to niggle at me. Um, so, for example, I started looking into the Australian Chinese media, Chinese language Australian media, and what was being discussed around health. And I haven't quite figured out how it fits around these conversations that I've mentioned. Um, these reports tend to report back on uh, changing health systems within Australia and how um, the Chinese population can respond to this or um, take it into their consideration when choosing practitioners and whatnot. But also, there was a lot of crisis reporting, particularly around SARS in the first SARS. Um, but that to me felt more a story about crisis reporting or pandemic history as opposed to the integration necessarily of Chinese health practices in Australia. And second, I have a question. I still have a question around, the relationship between health practices and migrant identities, as this project was very much motivated by a personal journey, which I've actually avoided mostly in the pursuit of my former career as a historian. But I still find myself very much interested in how personal health practices inform a sense of identity when you're in a migrant country. And I think to answer this, it would require more oral histories. Um, and so, yes, I leave you with those incomplete thoughts, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks so much. That was really terrific. I know how hard it can be to let go of a project when it's still in progress. So, thank you very much for sharing where you're up to. And it is really fascinating to hear your own, your childhood interest. This is a question or a set of questions that you've been living with for quite some time. And I know that as a woman in my early 50s, and I was recently adopted by a Chinese mother. And so when I get sick now, it is not medicine that comes in a blister pack. It's not the traditional things that I grew up with. The little book comes out with all its dog-eared pages, and the ailment is looked up, and then she works out whether I need to be hotter or colder, and then I am fed accordingly. And it is really disconcerting that it always works. So we do have some questions coming in. Um, and I appreciate that some things you'll just be able to speculate on, or some things you'll be able to say, that's coming out in what I do next. And of course, some
Mhm.
things you might actually have an answer to. So, one of the first questions that's come in is a really important question, I think, albeit is quite a predictable question. And it is around that gatekeeping. And you
Mhm.
have opened up a really interesting line of inquiry talking about the economics of this. And of course, pharmaceutical companies, big business, but also that visual grammar that you presented as part of your talk today. How much of it is economic protectionism and how much of it is just racism and a
Mhm.
fear of the other and a fear of what I personally don't understand? Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah. Um, yes. I think, mm, sorry, the reason why I hesitate to respond, and I'm thinking about this is because I think this is also, um, I think it's
It's
really
a big
hard.
question.
No, I think there is always going to be an element of racism where we think about others, right? Whether
Mm,
this is, I think all of those things, economic protectionism, professional protectionism, and a bit of fear of the other, whether we define that as racism, uh, I think will always be part of it, part of this story. I think what I've tried to, how I've tried to approach these sources and understanding it is actually just seeing these issues being aired and negotiated on a public in media, in mainstream media, I think is part of that conversation. And whether we kind of focus necessarily on the racist elements or seeing it as a continual uh, negotiation of grappling with what is not mainstream, I think is an important consideration. Because part of this project and what I've seen as well is that it's not just necessarily about Chinese alternative medicine. It can also, some of the things that I've noticed can relate to the ways in which alternative medicine is generally discussed. And what I do see over the course of the 1990s and 2000s and into the 2010s is less of is actually more of an acceptance and less of an explanatory reporting that occurs. This is something that I need to go back and sort of quantify in some ways around that. But I think it's a combination and all of that. And also, I just wanted to very quickly respond to your comment there about, it's not just in pill form. One of the conversations that came up around this as well and kind of ties to the sort of economic potential of herbal medicines and TCMs was that a lot of the time, one of the common criticisms being aired in the late 90s and early 2000s was the way in which TCM endangers uh, or is a threat to endangered wildlife and flora, sorry. And so a lot of the sort of response to this from practitioners is the changing ways in which alternative products are being used. So rather than finding tiger bone, we found there are some studies that suggest that pig bones ground up in the same way can provide this, similar effects. And it was this conversation that was taking place in Australia, relying on research that was being produced in China and in Australia and globally around the modernization of TCM. So this kind of gestures, and what I want to gesture towards here is this sort of modernizing process of traditional Chinese medicine started in China in the building of a modern state under the CCP, but the profession itself as an alternative mode of health has been modernizing. And I think these conversations in Australia are part of that global modernization conversation. So
Yeah, because the recovering vegetarian was a little bit startled by the picture of the deer looking cute and not quite frolicking, but
no,
enjoying a long weekend.
Yeah, they're
So
not hurt. I think when their antlers are removed because it's a natural seasonal process. But anyway,
process.
yeah.
But that does lead into another question of, have you seen the language in reporting change and become less dramatic? Because those two photographs that you showed, the guy looking very familiar, he looked like he could have been in any pharmacy in any suburb in Sydney. And then the other professional, with unpronounceable herbs, have you seen some of that language become a little bit more muted as time passes?
Yes and no. I think the language, there is always a reliance on language to show that this is alternative and other. So I think actually in an article like 4 days ago, in the Canberra Times, I think the title was Pointing Needles Isn't All Woo Woo, something along those lines. Definitely woo woo and pointing needles in that.
So much to
And
be
the
proud of.
but the article itself was kind of saying was pointing to the fact that acupuncture works. It's been,
Mm,
even though I'm a skeptic of alternative medicine, you know, enough Australians have used the service and told me about the fact that it works, that it works. So in some ways, I think the language is always being used to leverage um, a shock value, an interest value in the Australian media. But perhaps the message itself has changed slightly. I would also say that the frequency of which these interest stories or reporting on um, the regulation of
mm.
TCM has changed in frequency. And that's what I've seen, which makes
And
sense because regulation is there now. So, yeah, it's not as a current debate in some ways.
someone's just commenting that back in the 70s, the idea of being able to claim for acupuncture
Mm,
through your private health care fund would just not be possible. But
yeah,
now a lot of funds do
yeah,
actually recognize within certain limits that that
yeah,
is, you know, an approach that some people want to take. I
yeah.
have another question here that's slightly more complicated, but
Hmm.
looking at the idea of Chinese Australians or people in Australia with Chinese heritage using this rich history, even though you've unpacked how it has changed, um, particularly in recent decades, but as a source of solidarity, that there is
Mm,
this extraordinary
mm,
system of knowledge and
mm,
the idea that, you know, your mother is supporting another person of Asian heritage by
hmm,
taking
hmm,
you to
hmm,
them and trusting her
hmm,
child with them.
hmm,
So I wonder if that's something that
hmm. Yeah.
you can add to your list of niggling questions.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I think that question around, I think that's also a very important question um, to frame within the context of different Chinese migrant communities, seeing the different waves of Chinese migrants that have or Chinese background migrants that have come through Australia from like the 1970s onwards, or actually even before. I think that sense of community and why they revert to community for health um, would be different, I think. So yeah, it's interesting as well because I've been thinking about it from the perspective of the different generations of migrants, and again, on top of that, the different waves of migrants. So,
Mm,
you know, if you are a third, fourth generation migrant of someone who's moved here in the early 20th century versus um, you know, a second or third generation migrant of more recent, um, or depending on the path of migration as well, I think
yeah.
complicates this relationship with why you seek out or why you practice
Mm,
traditional health. And also that sense of solidarity as to who you go to. I imagine like my mum went to Yip Yi and took us to Yip Yi because he was a family friend.
yeah.
I haven't actually asked her whether there was another doctor on hand for us. Um, but yeah, and I think, you know, adding a personal perspective on it, you know, the things that I do grapple with personally as someone who
Mm,
grew up in Australia, um, is how to reconcile my very Western mode of thinking about health and
mm,
medicine and then rejecting, you know, what my nan told me about goji berries, what my mum tells me about drinking warm water with. It makes me feel better sometimes, and now I'm going back to it. So I
yeah.
think there's a lot of layers there, and I think an oral history project around this would be really interesting as an exhibition,
Because
rather than, yeah.
yeah, because I think too, some of what you alluded to today in those interviews, this
Mm,
idea that quite a rich and complex heritage is seen as, advice of last resort. Like, I've tried all these other things now. I'm going to go and try an
Mm,
acupuncturist because it's the
mm,
last thing on the
mm.
list. So it might be interesting to see how your work and the work of
Yeah,
other people in this space kind of challenge that and
yeah,
give it a bit more privilege.
yeah.
I need to wrap up. I
Yeah.
need to give everybody just a couple of public service announcements. First, this is the last Fellows findings for 2005. So it's an opportunity for me to thank very sincerely my colleagues in public programs, Lydia, Callum, Daniela, and Tanya, who help wrangle the booking system and make sure that all of these events appear online. And of course, somebody turns up every month and offers expert stage management services in the unlikely event that the technology goes wrong. So thank you very much for all your support throughout the year. And thank you to Kathy, who edits all of the content that you see, these polished pictures for different events that go up online. I cannot tell you how hard it is to be an editor in a library, a workplace
Mm.
where everybody has an opinion on commerce. So, some of our fellows will be on site and you can meet them in real life at a panel event. The last Fellows Forum for 2025 will be on the evening of Wednesday, the 26th of November. Come and hear some of our fellows talk about how they're telling histories for those histories that many people assume have already been told. It's all about the niche angle. And of course, our Fellows findings will be back in February 2026. Lots more projects, lots more Fellows, and I look forward to your company and your support. So stay safe and stay curious, everyone. I hope to see you soon. Bye bye. And thank you, Chi Chi. That was great.
Thank you very much. Bye.